Is Bernie Sanders in the way of a successful Democratic campaign to defeat the president?
Not necessarily. I'm actually neutral this time because I'm running the DNC data core, or the core the Democrats are going to use. Look, Bernie has put some ideas out there that have been helpful. I don't think we're going to do them the way Bernie would like to do them necessarily. But Medicare for all, for example, is a good idea. It's not probably a good idea to tell Americans we're going to take their insurance away from them. But it is a good idea to get it done. And we wouldn't be talking about that if it weren't for Bernie Sanders. So, I think he has a shot. Who knows who's going to win? There's going to be 15 or 20 candidates, and about 5 or 6 of them are going to get past the first 4 or 5 primaries and into California. Then we're going to find out.
I would suggest that you are not a socialist, a democratic socialist of the 14 modern flavors of socialism. Is this a fad, as we see on Time Magazine's cover last week, or does this idea of a new Democratic Party socialism, does it have legs?
No. I mean, yes and no. Socialism is it's sort of red baiting, and it's not going to be effective. Socialism means something different to people my age who grew up with the Soviet Union as a major threat and all this, and than it is to young people. We ought to have a universal health care system, as all the Europeans and the Canadians do. I don't consider those countries, mostly, some of them are, but mostly are not socialist. And their economies are doing just fine, if you've been talking about most of the morning, or most of them are anyway. So we need to have some things that other countries have that we should have as the premier industrialized country in the world. But I don't consider that to be embracing socialism. The other thing I want to make, and I don't want to use too much airtime, there is not a left versus right, significant left versus right problem in the Democratic Party. There are for some people. The major change in the Democratic Party is young versus old.
Okay, picking up on that, Governor, I'd be curious to know whether you think, therefore, there is room for a centrist Democratic candidate in this race.
What depends what a centrist Democratic candidate is. The answer is yes, of course there is, and there'll be more than one. Is Amy Klobuchar a centrist? I don't know. Bernie Sanders is clearly not a centrist. What about Sherrod Brown? Is he a centrist? I mean, these are all labels and names that we talk about in the media all the time. I think you have to look under the hood. Everybody's going to be for some form of Medicare for all. The question is, how are you going to get there? That's the key.
Is winning more important than ideology?
Absolutely, for me. I mean, I think this country is in a very bad path, in a very bad way. I think we're losing our strength as the premier industrialized power in the world. I think we're losing democracies. I think the Russians are making huge gains at our expense. Yes, I think we need a change in a hurry.
Howard Dean, light years ago, Peggy Noonan at the Wall Street Journal said you were very different. You grew up with a lot of advantages, fancy childhoods in East Hampton and all that. Okay, great. But you didn't grow up with a Gilded Age tone. And everybody watching this understands we're in an arch-gilded age now. Some would suggest the president represents that. How does the Democratic Party take advantage of the elite's wealth but not do a Gilded Age message?
Well, it will be a Gilded Age message because it's a bit of a Gilded Age. Look, I believe in capitalism, and I think capitalism can work, but no system works when it doesn't benefit the vast majority of people in the system, and it's not right now. So we really need to retool capitalism if we're going to save it. And I think we're smart enough to do that after the close calls during the Depression and even the recession. But we really have to, we've got to make sure that all those people that voted for Donald Trump have job opportunities and have educational opportunities. That's just plain common sense. In democracy, everybody should be benefiting from the system.
Governor Dean, we're thrilled to have you here today with Martin Feldstein of Harvard, who has a nodding acquaintance with fiscal responsibility. President Clinton knew of fiscal responsibility. Some would suggest even President Obama did better than good, and at times better than the Republicans. Do you see a fiscally responsible message from the liberals of the Democratic Party?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I would love to know, and I suspect I know what the answer is, what Dr. Feldstein thinks of modern monetary theory, which I am very interested in. As you know, I was very conservative about money when I was governor. I throw that one out there. I suspect I know what the response is going to be, but it is pretty interesting. And inflation is the bigger problem than deficits.
So there we are. Howard Dean with us, and we segue over to Martin Feldstein, Republican of Harvard University. Governor Dean mentioning inflation down the road. You do agree with Howard Dean on that, don't you?
I think it's a serious problem. I think that the Fed so far has been trying to get the inflation rate up, but the day will come when the inflation rate is higher than any of us want.
Governor Dean, picking up on the issue of inflation and picking up on people's wages, can the Democratic Party fix the Phillips curve? Can they produce wage growth for the average U.S. earner?
I think so. Here's what I believe we should be doing, and I'm not speaking for any of the candidates. They'll speak for themselves. I think we need to change the tax code really substantially so that instead of advantaging things like collateralized mortgage obligations and derivatives and all this stuff, we ought to let people get really rich investing in places like West Virginia and Kentucky and Arkansas, which have really, have suffered under this. It's not so much that trade has caused them to suffer. That's really not true. I think trade has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty over the last 20 years. But automation and artificial intelligence are going to be enormous challenges, particularly AI, for our children's generation. And we have got to start investing so that the wealth that can be created by the increased productivity is shared across the country, not just on the coasts.
Do you think you need a younger candidate to get that message across to the younger demography? Is age a barrier here?
Well, now that I have to be neutral because I'm, involved in the data plans, I have to be a little more careful. But I have been on record as saying that in the past.
Howard Dean, I look at what Professor Feldstein has said here about inflation and about monetary policy, and so much of this is the idea of getting back to a responsible financial system of real rates and of real interest rates and how should your Democratic Party function with the big banks, with the corporate Wall Street people? What's the new relationship you see there?
I do think I think Elizabeth Warren is right about some of that stuff. These institutions are so enormous that they really have sort of sucked all the money out of and directed it in a particular direction. And it's not going to ordinary working people and ordinary wage earners. So I do think big banks are too big. They argue that they need to be that size so that they can compete on the world market with other very large banks. I think the community banks are really important. I think some of the stuff that was done in the first year of Trump's administration to relax regulations on community banks was a good idea. Right. But I do not think it's a good idea to relax regulations on the very large institutions that are too big to fail, or we'll have another 2008.
Why did Secretary Clinton lose, and what does the Democratic Party need to do this time to not repeat that evening of November 2016?
Well, I mean, we can speculate about why Hillary lost.
Oh, come on, you know exactly, Howard.
Actually, I don't know exactly. If I was so smart, I'd be running myself.
Would you like to make an announcement here? Everybody else
No, I would
has.
not. Yes, I'm going to make an announcement right now. I'm not running.
Okay. What happened in 2016, and how does your Democratic Party avoid the mistakes that Secretary Clinton made?
There were a number of things that happened. One was that there was a pretty bitter division in the Democratic Party. Two, I think the Democrats, look, our base is women, young people, and people of color. And in the 2017 and 18 elections, that's who won the election. So now our base looks like the people who were sending to Washington and to the state legislatures. We picked up 350 state legislative seats, and they look like our base. That's what we have to do. I don't believe the Democratic Party will ever win again if we have two white men at the top of our ticket. So that's what we've got to do. We've got to go younger, we've got to go of color, and we have to go female.
Okay, so what are you saying to Vice President Biden this morning?
I say Vice President Biden should do whatever he thinks is right. Again, I'm going to do my best to stay out of picking people now that I have a responsibility for whoever wins. But I've said what I've said, and I'm not going to back away from it.
Governor, is data going to win this election? You talk about the candidates, you talk about kind of what message needs to be put out there, but talk to me about the effect the data is going to have.
That data?
Yeah.
Is good. Oh, it's enormous, and the Republicans are ahead of us. When we look at their innovations, we copy them. When we do well, they copy our innovations. That's how it always works. They have a database setup that's much better than ours, that's much more able to get out their vote. It's easily replicable, but it's going to take a lot of work and some money. But we at least have the format set up, and now we have to proceed to go ahead and do that. The good news is that 69% of young people basically voted Democratic for a centrist Democrat in Virginia. That was an extraordinary, extraordinary number. This is a generation that is not enamored of Donald Trump's rhetoric on the environment, on race, on immigration, on diversity, on gay rights. This is a generation that's going to end up, they don't actually consider themselves Democrats, but they're going to vote Democrats most likely for the rest of their lives because of Trump's damage that he's branded the Republican Party.